All right, good evening, everyone. I'm going to continue doing my comprehensive study prep. And despite my humming and hawing, this is actually probably one of my stronger topics. It's going to be for a military history comp, and it's going to be the question's an interesting one. And is it that any are there any theorists, any kind of 20th century or classical theorists, uh, strategists, excuse me, that apply to Canada after 1945. So I've spent about 6 minutes sketching everything out so you don't have to hear me humming and hawing doing it. We've got it right here. So some of the sources I'll be using for this one. The big one, I think, I'm going to start with Hugh Strahan, his article, The Lost Meaning of Strategy, which is really worth a look if you haven't already. Second is Basil Littlehart's book, Strategy, second edition. Third is probably I'll go with either R.J. Sutherland's Canada Long-Term Strategic Situation, which again is a real classic. Niels Orvik's Defense Against Help, also a classic. As Philip Lagasse talks about, often mentioned but not really read, and in fact, he's actually not on any of the major databases. I happen to have a PDF I took of an old microfilm, or excuse me, microfiche. So if you're interested, please message me, and I will send you a copy of that outdated. I mean, nowadays, if it's not electronic, it might as well be Indiana Jones vaulted. Also, Sean Maloney's, where are we? Yeah, chapter on forward security and the Canadian way of war. What else am I missing? Nope, that about covers it because I've got about an hour to write this paper. That's about 6 sources, and I'll be able to talk about that for an hour, no problem. Or excuse me, write about that for an hour, no problem. I'm not going to talk about it for an hour. I wouldn't do that to you. So, before we talk about strategists that apply to Canada's situation, we have to have a working definition of strategy. That brings us to Hugh Strahan. So Hugh Strahan, in his chapter, his article, The Lost Meaning of Strategy, it's the early 2000s. He's kind of critiquing the George Bush statement that our strategy is freedom. It's not a, I don't know. If you're waging war against kind of abstract nouns like terror, it kind of makes sense to have a strategy that is also an abstract noun. It doesn't really provide what strategy means. So the Strahan's point is that freedom can't even really be it's not a strategy or a policy. It's a policy aim. We can then talk about policy, and he links into Clausewitz. So everyone who proposes something, almost inevitably, if someone proposes something that frankly is a terrible military idea that just won't work, they'll say, but would be politically convenient. They'll say, but doesn't Karl say that war is merely a continuation of politics by other means? No, he doesn't. Not in our sense, right? So, old Karl was coming out of the Prussian tradition of Prussian idealism. He's coming out of a much more conservative society, and the translation of Politik, or Politik, anyway, with a K, German, actually translates more to policy. So if you're looking at like long-term policy objectives, long-term policy, that is sort of, or long-term policy traditions, that's more what Karl was getting at. That's what Hugh Strahan is saying. So we need to define the difference between policy, which is, kind of an objective. So if you're looking at from a Prussian point of view, a policy objective, or they might have a policy of expanding eastward to gobble up as much of Poland as they can before the Austrians and the Russians do. A strategy for doing that might be a military campaign. So he divides policy and strategy pretty cleanly. The strategy is the military accomplishment of an objective which supports a policy. I like it. It's clear. He actually argues that the term grand strategy clouds what we mean by policy by strategy. I disagree, but I can see where he's getting at. someone who actually helps clarify it is Basil Littlehart. Now it's fashionable to hate on Basil Littlehart because he did some skeezy stuff. He kind of led German generals to say in interviews he was giving that they'd read his work and he might have stolen some ideas from D.H. Lawrence. But one, he wrote a great biography of Sherman. It reads really well. And two, and he actually makes, I think, the right conclusion that William Tecumseh Sherman is the first modern general. Two, that his book Strategy, he talks about the difference between policy, strategy, and grand strategy. So in his view, grand strategy is the what's it called? The policy and action, right? So these are all the actions you have to take to make your policy happen, and that can include military, industrial, economic, all that noise. And if you look at any kind of modern doctrine, high-level doctrine from pretty much any Western military, they're going to have, well, you have your political objective at the top, and you're going to have, different strategies, and then you're going to have your military strategy, and underneath your military strategy, you're going to have the operational level or the operational art. Strahan's a big skeptic of the term operational art because it's often used to be it's often used by military leaders to basically say that I don't really have to a tactic. I can just do tactical stuff, and I can kind of translate it through the operational level, meaning I don't have to worry whether it's strategically relevant. We've kind of gone to operational art, which is more, it's not a separate layer. I'm getting sidetracked here, though. That's really boring, and I'm not going to talk about it. Point being, if you're looking to define strategy, that's a pretty good definition of grand strategy that strategy fits under. So now we've come to that. To summarize, policy is kind of like it's not party politics. It's kind of like that higher political objective, like what this guy might call, and that guy is Hans Morgenthau, might call the national interest. We have grand strategy, which is all of the things you need to do to implement that policy. And then you have strategy, which is a military thing. We're talking about military strategy here. It's almost worth mentioning, since we're at it, Lawrence Friedman's book. Friedman basically defines the difference between a strategy and a plan, as a strategy is when you have an opponent, right? It kind of fits in the military thing. It's another working definition of strategy that is helpful. So that brings us to Canada. What are Canada's policy interests in the kind of politique? I keep saying it with a French accent, but angry Frenchman, German. Anyway, German. Politic with a K. So there are two sources we can go at for this. For even more theoretical bounding, we can go to Nils Orvik. So Nils Orvik argues that in terms of a small state, in this particular case, Canada, there can be, and he compares us to Scandinavian countries. He's Nils Orvik, of course he would. There are three routes you can go down. You can go down symbolic defense, where there's really no way you can defend your sovereignty, but you're going to have symbolic defense as a political thing. If whoever comes, you're Iceland. Iceland has symbolic defense. Two, you have own help, right? Or self-help. So you rely on your own power, and that would be very much like, say, Sweden, right? They'll take on all comers, conscription, tanks and stuff. Or if you look at the S tank, it's a fascinating design, basically designed to stop Russians. It's just it doesn't even have a turret, just a big old gun driven by conscripts. And then you can have borrowed help. So that would be like some kind of treaty, right? Anyway, Orvik is arguing that for a small state like Canada, our main threat isn't actually an external aggressor. Whether we want to or if anyone attacks us, we're either going to be the only people who can credibly attack us really are either like a Russian nuclear attack or the Americans. We have no real credible way of defending against the Americans unless Orvik doesn't really talk about this, but unless we built a lot of nukes, we could train every Canadian in guerrilla warfare and built some nuclear weapons, it'd be a pretty strong deterrent. It just wouldn't be worth the cost of invading. But we're not going to do that. Thank goodness. Second thing, so anyway, our main threat is then defense against help, right? If someone does come to invade Canadian territory, we're actually the main threat to our sovereignty by that point are the Americans, because they would come and protect Canada. They might not leave if they felt insecure, so we have to secure ourselves in order to protect ourselves from our allies. Philip Lagasse points out that Orvik's argument is actually often taken a little too, not as literally as actually he wrote it. Orvik was actually advocating a very specific policy, a much bigger military, and so on. So that brings us to R.J. Sutherland. So R.J. Sutherland, who will be the subject of my dissertation. So anyway, Canada's long-term strategic situation. He argues that Canada basically has two invariants in our policy, or in our long-term outlook, and that is one, that we're basically either invulnerable or indefensible. Like there's no, we're linked to the United States, right? Either we're 100% secure because we're attached to the U.S., or the U.S. decides to either someone attacks the U.S. or the U.S. attacks us, and it's over for us. Like if the U.S. goes, we go. If the U.S. decides that we go, we go. On the other part of it, Canadians are not an isolationist people. We're just not. Never will be. Or I can't say never, but for the foreseeable future will not be. So we have to have some sort of engagement. However, we want to be engaged abroad, but there's no real natural limit, right? You look at, for example, the UK or Britain. Britain naturally needs a big navy because they're importing their food and stuff, and they're a trading nation. They're a small island, so on and so forth. I mean, Canada, you look at all our capital, it's pretty much, especially for the first part of our first 100 years of our history, it's all getting just kind of sucked into Canada just to develop all those natural resources, and we're always looking for capital. It's a good chunk of Canadian economic history. So, you have those two invariants kind of guiding us, which kind of fits in neatly with Orvik's idea. He also talks about the involuntary guarantee, which is a great word, a great term that gets actually thrown around in Canadian government circles quite a bit. Actually, if you're looking to talk about, I'll just mention the book, Pirouette by Bothwell and Granitstein. It's worth looking into the impact of that. So you get the involuntary guarantee. Actually, if you're looking at, if you're interested in R.J. Sutherland, this book's pretty good. Avoiding Armageddon by Andrew Richter. So anyway, where was I? Yes, okay. We were talking about the involuntary guarantee. Whether we want to or not, the U.S. will protect us, and we can either do it on our own terms or the U.S. terms. So that brings us to our actual strategy. So how do you build, what kind of military objectives do you have? How do you employ armed force in support of those kind of wider policy objectives? Now, there are a few takes on it. I argue that in terms of understanding our Canadian strategy, or understanding a strategy for Canada, you kind of have to take Basil Littlehart's concept of the, not so much the indirect approach, but the idea of limited liability, and what he actually calls the strategy of the limited aim, but apply it to our allies. So, Littlehart, he advocates for a kind of like a more limited war, right? He advocates for a country like Britain, because of its geography, history, economics, and so on, when it fights in kind of more global conflicts, it should actually look to take strategic bits. It should use its natural advantages of the Navy and economics, and then sort of trade at the end. Like, it shouldn't fight absolute wars, it should fight limited wars, and by fighting those limited wars, it should look to gain, like, play the long game, gain incremental advantage over time. If you combine that idea with where we actually stand in terms of the involuntary guarantee, the invariance, and Orvik's idea of defense against help, we actually have a strategy of limited aim, but the strategy of limited aim with a twist is directed against our allies. And I mean this in the best way possible. So, it doesn't mean we're stabbing our allies in the back. What it does mean is that we're using our limited military force because, except in exceptional circumstances, Canada isn't a great military power. We're using our contributions strategically to gain certain key concessions in areas that really matter to us. And so, if you look at how that's actually applied, one interesting account is Sean Maloney's book, In Service of Forward Security. Actually, no. Sorry, that's the name of his article, or his book chapter. But Canada and UN Peacekeeping by Sean M. Maloney. Where he argues that Canada was actually contributing to the Western Alliance throughout its much vaunted peacekeeping activities in the early Cold War. For example, he'll bring up like Cyprus, right? Cyprus was actually like a British V-bomber base, and Canadians were there largely to secure the V-bomber base. Or, also Canadian participation in, say, UNMOGIP, which was the UN Military Observer Group in India and Pakistan. That was originally a U.S. Strategic Air Command base. So he's arguing, his account, and he argues that we have a long strategic tradition called forward security, where we're fighting overseas to prevent stuff getting at home. I would say yes, but what we're actually really worried about, Sean Maloney would say that we're doing that to kind of keep war at arm's length. I would argue, taking a twist on Little Heart's thing, or Little Heart's idea thing, come on, I'm a PhD student, we're actually using that to keep our allies at bay, right? Which is an interesting take. Another, just an honorable mention here goes to James Ayres. He kind of wrote In Defense of Canada. Anyway, I have it. Trust me, I have it. I don't want to make this video more boring than it... Oh, now it's bothering me. Anyway, I don't want to make this video more boring than it already is. In Defense of Canada, James Ayres argues that Canada has a potlatch approach, that we just kind of contribute forces to get stuff back. That has a limited applicability. If we go all the way back to the start, we actually benefit from picking specific military ends to achieve those aims. So, look at Sean Maloney's bit. One of the reasons that Canada picks peacekeeping is because we're actually considered, we're a bit more acceptable, so it's a bit easier to get Canadian troops in to do these things than, say, Americans or Brits. I would argue, if you look at another great example where we use defense against help, is in the 50s when we spent a ton of money on air defense, partially because at that point Canada's either, Desmond Morton described Canada as either indefensible or invulnerable. I have the book, so I'll hold it up. Why not? Yes, there we are. Indefensible or invulnerable. In the 50s, a Soviet bomber, manned bomber with a hydrogen bomb. A hydrogen bomb can do a lot of damage, and a manned bomber is relatively easy to shoot out of the sky. So, we are both defensible and vulnerable. And in that case, we actually spent a ton of money on air defense. Including, for example, trying to develop our own indigenous interceptor. Not going to get into that. Anyway, I'm not an Navarro fan. Regardless, that helps kind of describe why Canada took on that. I mean, our defense budget tripled between 1950 and 1952. A lot of it went into the Air Force, and that was partially because we were looking to gain, we were doing that combination of Little Heart with Nilzorvik of there's an area where we can concentrate our limited resources. That particular area helps us defend against helps us defend against our allies. So it's that kind of combination of limited aim with kind of fending off our allies in terms of defending against help. So with that word soup, I'm going to end this video because it has been going on for 20 minutes. I hope you've enjoyed it.